Inside the Mark 8 GTI Euro spec, we're going to talk about the pros and cons of this interior space because they've made some massive changes here. Some are quite controversial, but let's start with the pros. Take a look at something like the door panel. It's all matte textures, there's nothing glossy there to get full of fingerprints. The armrest is very comfortable and the storage area is still lined with felt like the previous generation, which is great because my gold bullion doesn't clank around. When you get to the inner parts of the cabin, the center armrest is still ratcheting. It is extremely comfortable. And there's this level of cleanliness that you feel in here and airiness. It's like if you had 3 maids stopping by 10 times a day at your home. It feels spotless. It feels in order. And you don't feel claustrophobic. That is the primary feeling that you get when you sit in here. Now let's talk about seating comfort. These Clark seats, which is just glorified plaid, they breathe well because they're cloth. So if you're in the winter, you're not just going to get your bum icicled. Or in the heat, you're not going to burn yourself if you're wearing shorts or short shorts like I do. The back seats are excellent for 2 adult passengers, even with the front seats moderately back or reclined. Now if you sit like Jack where you're basically leaning in the back seat, you're going to be uncomfortable. The hatch space is pretty good. It's not nearly as good as something like the Civic hatch, which just dominates, but it's a good balance between that city car where this thing isn't enormous and something you can take on the highway, and that's why people love this. It does everything well. The last pro is the Harman Kardon audio system, and I pray it comes to the North American market because our audio engineer said this is the first modern VW product he's tested that does not give him a headache. However, he's quite finicky, but the audiographs support his analysis. The harmonic distortion is well controlled at 80 decibels, which is normal listening volume. There's not a ton of spikes or hash there. When you look at the frequency response, you can also see that they don't have this crazy bass-heavy sound signature. The clarity is also good. It's quite linear for a VW product. Now we're going to get into some of the negatives. And yes, before I say that, the storage and all of the cubbies and little nooks and crannies they put in here are great because they've cleaned up all the physical controls. And the byproduct of doing that means usability is extremely poor for a car that you still have to drive with a steering wheel and shift and all the other things. So before I complain about it, I'm going to show you the difference between doing fundamental operations with a Mark 7.5 GTI. So if I want to turn up and down the volume in the old car, I can keep my eyes on the road, I can take one hand off and just turn a rotary knob. On the new car, I have to swipe either on the steering wheel left and right, which I could probably not look at that, but on the center dashboard, since I don't have a volume knob, you have to look over for the plus and minus and swipe left or right like a smartphone. Next is the HVAC controls. On the Mark 7.5, you had a nice little rotary knob that I didn't even have to look at to turn up and down to raise the temperature, and the fan speed. On here, you physically have to press the climate button first to adjust the fan speed, and then you have to swipe left or right on the touchscreen. All of this requires you to take your hands off the wheel, or one hand, and then look down because you can't just touch or feel it. And I know the argument is, well, there's haptic feedback, you know when you hit a button, but you still have to look at it. The last and the most egregious is like the traction control button, which is now buried in a whole subset of menus. But all this menu jumping, it's clear to me that they designed this for a future product that is not here yet. This is not a self-driving car. You still have to interact with it. And on a bench or in a lab, all of this design might look cool, and it does look cool from the outside, but when you use it, it is absolutely frustrating. But that's enough of the interior space. There's a lot of technical things to talk about in the shop, so let's have at it. Underneath the Mark 8 GTI, and Jack has strong-armed Volkswagen Group to bring us one from Germany. This is a Euro spec model.
So what that means is that not all of the individual trim pieces and some of the options will carry over from Germany to here in the United States, most notably the engine. Our engine is different than the Euro spec model.
We'll get into that in a minute. But there are some changes here, Jack.
So in this video, we're going to explain to you what those changes actually do from a technical perspective and how that translates into an improved driving experience. So Mark, for this generation GTI, Volkswagen's targeted a couple things, but specifically they wanted to improve refinement of the ride, they wanted it to be a more direct handling and driving experience, and they wanted to, of the GTI, to make it a overall improved experience.
And they wanted to eliminate understeer completely,
yes,
as they have told us. So how did they go about making all these changes to make this the perfect front-wheel drive car, Jack?
So this is still an MQB, which is their global front-wheel drive platform. On the outside or the exterior, you'll notice all new body panels, front and rear. What that translates to, other than a different styling experience, is a reduced coefficient of drag. So this car should be more aerodynamic. And in the rear, they've reduced lift, which means there should be higher high-speed stability when you're doing 140 miles an hour down the highway.
When I'm doing 200,
oh,
I'm going to
all right.
one of my NOS bottles come in here.
When you go to space in your Fiero?
Yeah, when I go to space in this thing. So what else?
MQB, the front subframe has been changed, and this is a big change. They went from steel to aluminum, so not only does that drop 6.6 pounds, but it also dramatically improves rigidity. And that does what, Mark?
You also have hard points that are more rigid, and you have an aluminum knuckle or upright to the strut on this. Having an aluminum subframe, although 6.6 pounds does not sound like a lot, that is unsprung mass. It is at the lowest point of the car, so when you save weight here, that is a big deal in terms of dynamics. And then, of course, all the other suspension points. And you said that they've made some serious improvements in bushings and all that as well?
Yeah, so all the bushings are different in this car. The front spring rates are 5% higher, the rear spring rates are 15% higher, and the dampers are entirely revised. This car has DCC, which is their adaptive dampers. The software and the shock itself has been changed. Not to mention that, Mark, they have also changed the way all of these subsystems relate to one another. So EPS, XDS, which is their torque vectoring by brake, their VAQ front-wheel drive differential, which is clutch-based, and their stability control systems are all tied together now under one subsystem called VDM, Vehicle Dynamics Manager. And that's very similar to what Porsche and Audi already do. And there's a huge advantage to that.
There's a huge advantage. If you've seen our Audi videos, you should check out the RS6. We go into great detail about the electronic controlled chassis. And the whole point is to connect A, B, C all the way through from the driver input to the electric subsystem instantaneously.
There's a more organic reaction
Correct.
to all the subsystems working together. And a huge thing to bring up, this car will allow you to fully disable stability control. You could not do that on the 7.5, 7, or Mark 6 GTI. So that is huge if you're going to take this on the track.
I can't wait to try that part out because that is a huge part. When I drove, and you can watch the video, it was a little long-winded with the Mark 7.5. That driving experience, as good as it was in some cases, when you got it at that limit, you know, the car would start to understeer and then you could feel the front end correcting. It had this very vague front, or just the way that it was controlling itself.
It didn't feel natural.
It didn't feel natural at all, and that's one of the things they claim they have attempted to fix along with the understeer problem of the last generation.
This car also rides better than the prior generation car and is quieter. The last thing I want to talk about in the front are these tires and brakes. So this car has been shipped to us on RE71Rs. So from a dynamics perspective, it will be louder. The tires are noisier, but this is best case scenario on the track.
Yeah, and this was my complaint with VW. You know, they shipped us the car and they said, well, we've eliminated understeer. And then you put one of the stickiest street tires on the planet, at least in this day and age. And of course, you're going to reduce understeer. But when you drive it, you're also going to get a feel of what happens to the suspension, what happens to the chassis, and what happens to the grip. When you put the best case scenario tire on, how is the body going to react to that, or the car's body? Is it going to roll more? Is it going to grip but kind of give you weird dynamics? So I'm interested to see how that all works.
But I will say, even with these tires, with their incredibly stiff sidewall, this still rides better than my Mark 7.5, and the cabin is still quieter. Lastly, the brakes. At least in the GTI, not the upcoming Golf R, this shares the identical rotor and caliper from the prior generation Golf R.
Okay, so what else do we have, Jack?
Well, that's really about it, Mark. Let's get underneath the hood and talk about the engine.
Sounds good.
So, Mark, this is the EA888 engine. This is not what we get here in the United States. This is both port and direct injected. However, when compared to the prior generation engine that this is somewhat replacing, you have a small bump in horsepower and torque. It now makes about 240 horsepower. I believe it makes another 15 or 18 foot-pounds of torque. What that translates into is obviously more performance. The reason we do not get this engine in this country is for two reasons. One, cost, and the other one, emissions.
And VW did say it's the emissions regulations for the EU and all the things related to that, but the cost factor has got to be there too. They didn't say cost specifically, but you have to add a whole other set of fuel rails, fuel lines, high pressure fuel pump, and an additional set of injectors for the direct injection and the port injection system. So that's got to be it. I don't know because we haven't driven the new EA888 for the American market yet to see what tuning differences were done there. But we know right off the bat that whatever tuning has been done has been significant. It does feel pretty lively.
Yes. Speaking of fueling, Mark, one of the main things they changed on this car is they improved the injectors. They now flow far better than the prior generation. They've also, I believe, added a oil cooler. So when you're driving this thing on track like we have, in our shorter sessions, this thing did not go above like 240.
245. I think it was like 248, something like that. And that's not, we're not
and
talking
for
about
oil
long.
temp.
Anyway, it seems to be a big improvement over the previous generation. We still have a 6-speed manual option and a dual clutch, which is 7 gears.
Yes. And again, they both go through a limited slip differential, and that is the VW Audi Group clutch-based diff that they call VAQ. Other than that, Mark, really not much else to talk about.
Oh, Jack, I've been waiting to sit in the GTI Mk8.
I know you had your mod ready, your cotton flavor vape. We're here at Autobahn Country Club. Before we take this out on the north track to pound this around at track speeds, I wanted to walk the boys and girls through what this thing's like to drive on the street.
I feel like I'm gonna need a stage 2 suppository by the time you're done with this. Oh!
Oh my God.
Oh, these tires.
So the first thing I want to talk about is the engine. As we already talked about in the shop, this is not a American or North American spec motor. This is a Euro spec car, but this isn't any indication of what this thing is going to be like for us. It is far more powerful than the outgoing Mark 7.5. It seems to have a wider availability of torque, and it pulls hard to redline.
And we did a drag race that was the world's worst drag race, which we're going to show you, where you raced your dad. We can't seem to do it right, but the long story short is this car is faster than the old one every single time, even if you're
an idiot.
Yes, let's just put it that way. So we got the speed out of the way. The motor's better a little bit.
Yes.
Even though it's not really that much different. What are we talking about in terms of handling and overall feel compared to your previous generation car?
The first thing I think that's worth bringing up before we talk about ride quality is actual day-to-day comfort. This is a much quieter car. Despite this having RE71Rs, which are the world's loudest tire, the overall noise floor of this vehicle seems to be much lower when you're on the highway. There's less wind noise, there's overall less ambient noise in this car. The ride quality, and we talked about why in the shop, it is substantially softer, and over bad pavement doesn't throw you around. The front end of this car feels very, very similar till you start pushing it harder, at least on the street, and we're gonna find out what this is like when you're going 10/10ths. The front end seems to be far more composed. It doesn't scrabble around for grip anywhere as hard, and unlike the Mark 7.5, doesn't have a problem putting down the available torque.
How is it like just on the street in terms of flatness here?
So we are, let me put this into sport mode. These seats, which as we talked about in the interior segment, they're very comfortable, but I do think if you're going to be hot rodding this around with your passenger as you're about to demonstrate it, I guarantee you this is not an exaggeration of what these things are like to hold you in, but here we go, Mark.
I slipped right out of it. I'm serious, like that's just my body going through this. Holy shit! I mean, literally out of the seat.
So your passengers, unless they are huge, are going to have a bad time in the passenger seat. But the front end does a much better job in pulling itself out of corners, even at lower speeds. There's a ton of front end confidence, and overall, this is a much better driving car on the street. I really have no complaints with it other than kind of the infotainment thing we talked about, which is, you know, overall I feel like this is a car that took 2 steps forward and like a half a step back. Like the seats are better despite not holding you in, and again, these are not the leather seats. I don't know what they're going to be like on the Golf R. The interior space is quieter, the audio system's better, it rides better, it's faster. I mean, in every conceivable way, I think this is a step forward.
Well, that's what we're here to do. We're here to focus on the driving part of this in this segment, and I think, Jack, now is a good time to maybe take it a little bit faster and talk about some of the overall dynamics.
All right.
I'm serious, dude. I'm not.
Very comfortable and more suited for street driving than this.
Yeah, the track, obviously this is not a track car, but let's talk about this. We have RE71Rs. Anybody that's ever autocrossed before, it knows exactly what these tires are. It transforms this car. This is best case scenario in terms of grip. And wow, is this thing better than the old one. They said they got rid of understeer, and yes, the tires help, but I can literally put my foot to the floor and this thing doesn't want to wash out.
And we walked through why, though, at the shop.
Yes.
The way they've tied all these suspension systems together to make a huge difference.
So,
but also
yeah,
how the car puts power down, it feels far more natural than the 7.5. If you've driven one hard, you know it feels like it's pulling you by your hair out of the corner, scrabbling, and the inside and the outside is fighting the car. This, I don't feel like it feels that way at all, Mark. I feel more natural.
it's so natural. And so I'm just going to talk about kind of my complaints about the original GTI that I drove, the Autobahn version. And what you'll notice with that is everything kind of felt like it was delayed. The front end wasn't really reacting the way that you wanted. It would wash out before the diff would kind of pull you in. And in this case, when I get deep into braking, you turn, yes, it's wet here, so that rear will walk a little bit. Like the other car, it would not walk at all. So you have to watch the back end, which is great because this car wants to rotate through a turn. But when you get into the brake, I turn in, I put my foot down, oh my God, it doesn't push or want to wash out at all compared to the last car. So it makes it way easier to drive. A case like this right now, I'm foot to the floor every corner, and the car is not wanting to pull it off the road. It's actually rotating through the corner. This is one of the best front-wheel drive cars I've ever driven. I mean, just as really like a cruiser that's not a track car. I mean, the dynamics are so amazing here for what this is. I almost forget for a minute that it's front-wheel drive, and I'm not kidding you. Foot to the floor, honest to God, foot to the floor, no, virtually no understeer.
It's mighty impressive. This car dynamically, you know, outside of some of the complaints we had already, dynamically to me, this is easily 25% better than the last gen, at least out here.
Oh God, dude, this is more than that. To me, it's like 65, 70%.
It's a really, really good car. As I was telling you on the drive out here, this is one of the best front-wheel drive modern cars I've been in. I'd rather be in this than a Veloster.
Honestly, I didn't believe you because you're like, oh, it's not a Type R, but you know, and like you can't compare it to a Type R. You got to compare it to an SI. And this once people get this thing tuned, you know, you got real tires on here. This is incredible, man. I mean, seriously, I didn't think it would be anywhere near this good.
Yeah, it's a really, really great car. How does the engine feel and gearbox feel on track?
Well, the gearbox, I mean, all these modern manual trans, it's just this cable, plasticky feel, but it's real natural once you get used to it. There's decent weight to it. The gear engagement's good. The clutch is, I mean, it doesn't have a ton of feel, but I mean, it's a manual trans. At least it's there. And I would say, at least in engine performance, I don't know if it's the European tuning for this thing, but to me, it's way more alive than the other car. It feels less to hesitate. You don't get that mid RPM kind of this hesitation or like it's pulling timing. It just has a really natural progressive build to the, I don't even know what the red line is, like 6,000 RPM red line.
7.
Oh, it's 7?
Yeah. I mean, to me, Mark, this pulls way harder to redline the last one. Well, it doesn't sound great. It is still 4-popper. This is a massive improvement. The last thing I want to talk about before we head into the final thoughts, Marks, other than brakes, it is such a welcome return that you can fully turn off stability control in this car.
It completely transforms this car. I'm not kidding. I'm not even exaggerating it. You are in this corner, I'm foot to the floor, and the car is working with you versus against you.
It's not fighting you. Before,
it doesn't fight you at all.
If there was any rotation in the 7.5, the system would come down like a hammer and try its best to to mitigate that.
There's
and to me,
no interference.
Yeah,
None.
it killed that car. Blasting brakes, Mark, before we're out of here.
I mean, I'm not driving as hard as I normally would because we're on street pads, but so far we're in like lap 4, and I'm kind of, you know, 80% in the brakes, and I mean, there's a little bit of fade, but it's not horrible. If you get this car and you put a real set of tires on here, you are gonna be so happy with this compared to the previous gen, and I think that's the takeaway for me. This is a car that I would have avoided owning and going right to the Golf R before because of just the way the front end was. This 100% the biggest surprise of the year for me.
Yeah, it's
the biggest surprise.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing. So with that, Mark, let's head into the final thoughts.
Final thoughts on the Mk8 GTI. Big thanks to Jerome and Megan for helping us with the technical information. And I think it's pretty apparent from my driving impressions how big of a wow factor this car is. And I gotta hand it to them. After the past few VWs I've gotten out of in terms of driving dynamics, the bar for me was set really low. My expectation level was this was gonna be very similar to the Mark 7.5, and it is not. They put the money and development and the energy into taking this car from kind of a messy experience at the limit to something that you can really take off the street and then have some fun when you drive it hardcore at 10 tenths. I talk about this with a lot of these faux fun cars. When you get to 7 or 8 tenths of driving, pushing them, they start to fall apart. And the 7.5 generation car was that same way. You get at the limit, you don't know what's happening. This car is such a joy to drive. It is so rewarding. They've improved everything they needed to, and they have eliminated almost all of the understeer, and I don't know how much of it is with tires. But the big thing, and Jack said this, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and that's all in the interior space. It's a clean design, the seats are great, the comfort's good, it's quiet, it rides great in all conditions, but they trying to jump a generation ahead. And I asked them this on the phone. I said, you know, we're not in the fully autonomous car phase yet. We still have to drive our car. So taking your hands off, to have to look at a screen, to have to look at the HVAC controls, to touch everything, constantly interact with them, and go through multiple layers of menus to do the simple things that they removed by taking away all the physical controls is a massive mistake. It'd be way different if this was a car that drove itself, but it doesn't. So until then, I think they need to find a better balance, and that's, I think, going to be most of the complaints that people have about this generation of car. But other than that, I am absolutely blown away. This is one of the best front-wheel drive cars I've driven that balances street and a little bit of fun. Check it out. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.